confession to make this morning. Glad you all could be here for it. It's only something I realized recently about myself. It's hard. I am not a lesbian. Now, this realization doesn't mean I'm not giving up my relationship with Beth. Don't be afraid. Doesn't mean I'm not. Keith said, "Oh, there's a chance? Hang on, my man, hang on."
Now he's turned all red.
I know. Doesn't mean I'm giving up my relationship. Doesn't mean I'm giving up fighting for equality and civil rights for LGBTQ people. But as author and Catholic priest Richard Rohr points out, my true identity, that higher divine self, has absolutely nothing to do with my sexual orientation. My higher divine self, your higher divine self, the divinity within each of us, is genderless. We are all sort of androgynous here. We don't have a sexuality, much less a gender. Indeed, he says, these are all our small self trappings. Your body image, your job, your education, your clothes, your money, your car, your sexual identity, your success, and so on. That's not who we really are. That's not who any of us really are. So in that vein, I am also not an American. I am not a Southerner. I am not a writer. I am not a woman. I am not a musician. I am not an independent voter. I am not a Democrat. I am not a libertarian or a Republican. I'm not a pastor. I am none of these things. These are all what Richard Rohr calls the false self, and there is nothing in your false self that is bad per se. Instead, he says this is simply our launching pad. It contains all the identities, all the patterns that we have built up over our lifetimes to get through the day and create a life for ourselves out in this bodily world. They are a nice enough platform to stand on, Rohr says, but they are largely a projection of our self-image and our attachment to it. So when we can move from what Rohr calls that false self, or what A Course in Miracles would call your ego, into who we truly are, that higher divine self, that true self, as Rohr calls it, then we can experience what this weekend, what this day, July 4th, is all about on a deeper spiritual and metaphysical level, and that is true liberation and freedom. Now, when I first read those words from Richard Rohr, I was really taken aback. I had to go back and read it. I mean, sexual identity, how did that creep in there? What are you talking about, man? I figured if my sexual orientation is part of my false self, then I have wasted a lot of my life. I really have. What have I been doing with my life? I mean, back in the 90s, I started a web magazine for LGBTQ Christians. I wrote a book to help LGBTQ Christians reconcile their spirituality and sexuality. I have been involved in activism for years for that community to secure their right just to exist, not just in faith communities, but in the world. If this is all just a figment of my false self, what has been the point of this? What's been the point of this life? Well, I don't think that Rohr would say that I have wasted my time here on these pursuits, mainly because they were an important part of my own journey into wholeness, and because my efforts did make a difference in the lives of other people in the world. Those false self-identities, such as sexual orientation or careers or education, possessions, bodies, these are all tools that we've been given and that the Holy uses to help us remember who we really are, that we are infinite spirits having this human experience while still connected to something inexhaustible, as Rohr says. Where we go wrong, according to Rohr, is when we become attached to the false self. And we believe that we are the identities that we create from this space. So if we begin to identify only or primarily as our sexual orientation or our political beliefs or our nationality or our race or our gender or our political affiliation or whatever, and we make them sacred in some way, when we become attached, that's where we go wrong. Because that's when we start to see these identities as something that needs to be protected and defended. And we build like-minded groups, and we create our little echo chambers around our attachments to these labels, and then we label anyone that we see outside of this group as an enemy who must be resisted or defeated or in some cases annihilated. So when we cling too tightly to the identities that we create in our false self, we enhance the separation that we feel from one another. We enhance the separation that we feel from God. We enhance the separation that we feel within ourselves. When we set up camp, and we choose sides, and we divide against one another, and we go to war over the slightest of offenses, that's when we know we're attached. That's the false self. We see it in this very moment as our cultural and racial and class and political divides seem to be deeper than ever. We're all attached to that false self that chooses up sides. And the more we get attached to that false self and defend it and make it our entire reality, the more frightened we become of one another. And the more likely we are to forget that all the world is one. Breathe deep. You know, it's scary and it's kind of discombobulating to think that the identities that we hold so dear can be part of something called a false self. Indeed, it can lead us to an identity crisis that can often feel like we're at war with ourselves. It can make it feel like our lives and the world is falling apart in many ways. And we often tell others, oh, I'm just trying to keep it together. Just trying to hold things together, make it work. We try to do it with everything. Try to keep it together. But you know, sometimes it might be better to just let things fall apart. Just let it go ahead, collapse. But we try to keep relationships and careers, financial situations, living arrangements, even government and political systems together, when maybe the best thing we can do is allow them to fall apart. I tried to keep my identity as a journalist together for a very long time, some 20 years, but a career I went into because I loved it became over time too painful. And it was turning me into this very hard and cynical and angry person, and I didn't like her one little bit. Eventually, the pain was so much I had to give it up. And you know what? My life fell apart. It did. But what was on the other side was amazing. If I had kept it together, if I had stayed as a journalist, we wouldn't be here this morning. Jubilee Circle wouldn't exist. I'd still be at CNN, pissed off. Hating life. This is one of the opportunities that I opened myself to receive when I allowed my career to fall apart. Over the years, I've allowed other identities to fall apart. Identity as straight, you know, when I was very young. An identity as a cynical and angry person. An identity as a shy and timid person. There was a time in my 20s when I was with my first girlfriend, and you could look me directly in the eye and ask me a question, and she would answer. And I would be like, that's cool. I was like, leaving the house was a big deal. I was very shy. But I had to let that go. The best thing I ever did was stop keeping all that together. So as we celebrate this July 4th weekend, here's another thing we might want to stop trying to keep together. Our current form of government. Our founding fathers came up with an amazing idea for this republic, and it has served us well for about 245 years, give or take. But I truly believe that our founders saw how this system could break down, how it could fall apart. And over the years, those guardrails have either been removed or broken down, and now we are left with what I believe is an irretrievably broken system. We're trying to keep it together, I think, because we believe the only alternative is fascism or some form of authoritarian rule. But I don't think that's true. I fully believe that enough people in this country have transformed their consciousness to such a state that if our current system were allowed to fall apart, what would emerge from the ashes will be a more equitable, a more egalitarian society with far more people being helped than those who are being helped by the current system. And this is what I believe. If America dies, it will not be because an authoritarian government takes over. America will die from a lack of imagination. Albert Einstein once famously said that you can't solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. And that is why I believe so many people now are working to achieve a higher consciousness so we can create together, collectively, what the Course calls the happy dream, where we put systems in place that are created from that higher frequency. The old frequencies, they're beginning to die. That's why we seem so hopelessly divided and at war with one another right now. Those old patterns of division are being recognized for what they are. And I believe we can heal them. It's going to be painful, sure. But if you have ever had a broken bone, you know, sometimes the pain is unbearable before the healing is complete. So I believe America's false self, our identity as rugged individuals who are all separate from one another, and it's dog-eat-dog world and everyone for themselves, I think that system is falling apart. And why don't we let it? On the micro level of our own individual lives, Rohr says, when we can release the false self, it will feel like we have lost nothing. And if you have ever shed an identity before, you know it's painful, but on the other side, it doesn't feel like you've lost anything. I look at journalism jobs even today. I'll look them up and, you know, I'm like, oh, I'm qualified for that. Oh, my God, why? Why would I ever do that again? I haven't lost anything. In fact, he says, it will feel like freedom and liberation. I am free from the self that wanted to do that work. You are now connected, he said, to something inexhaustible. I believe it's true on the macro level as well. A new identity for this country, a new form of freedom and liberation is trying to emerge, and it can't come into existence as long as we are fighting to keep doing the things the way we have always done them. Jubilants, we are here to hold the space for that higher frequency. We are here to become the catalyst for that happy dream to emerge, that new future on both the micro-personal level and the macro country and world level. I believe that new future is one of collaboration. It is one of community. It is one of unity. It is a time where people finally realize all the world is one. Breathe deep. Well, I wondered if somebody would walk out, and Cece has had it with me. She's like, no. I do not agree. Anyway, and you're free, feel free to disagree with me. That's what America is about, right? The freedom to disagree. But here I am, all pipe dreamy and revolutionary this morning. I'm asking you to allow the government systems to just fall apart so some utopia can emerge, right? Well, it seems like those just tuning in who don't know me or or seeing this for the first time, they think, well, she's kind of lost her mind. And you know what? I have, in some way. Thanks, Michael. In some way, I have lost my mind because I'm giving up the part of my mind that wants to take sides. I'm giving up the part of my mind that wants to label me as some special thing because I'm an American or a patriot or a flag lover. And I invite you to do the same. Because we only take sides out of fear. We take sides out of the lower frequencies of our false self that needs an enemy. Our reading from the Course tells us that we create enemies out of one another because we can't live with that fearful false self inside of ourselves anymore. So we project all those fears outward onto those around us. We blame other people for making a mess out of the world. We fear that those that we see different from ourselves might take over. They might enslave or oppress us in some way, maybe in the ways that we have used systems to enslave and oppress others. I mean, we really certainly don't want others to do unto us as we have done to them, right? This is the state of separation that we live in all the time. We see enemies outside of ourselves, and we use them, the Course says, to symbolize our fear. The real war, says metaphysical teacher Kyle Cease, the real war is going on within ourselves. Since there's only one of us here, of course, that's the whole world. So we reenact that war out in the world. We see each other as symbols of our fear. Cease says that the war rages because we can't accept the world as it is. And so we feel unseen. We feel unloved. Those on the other side of the political aisle, he says, just represent our parents who don't get us and don't appreciate us. So we just project that fear onto them. Jesus, he dealt with the same issue when they were walking around and Peter says, hey, what's going to happen to that guy? You know, the disciple you love so much. He thought it was going to be unfair. That guy's going to get special treatment. Peter was projecting fear and hate on this other disciple, and Jesus says, what's that to you? What's that to you? What is that to you? Why is that even your concern? Follow me. And that's the message for us on Independence Day. Stop worrying about keeping the false self together. What's that to you? Whether it's your personal self or the corporate self, let it fall apart. Our highest purpose is to follow our divinity, to follow our Christ consciousness, to follow the higher divine self, the only thing that can bring us real freedom and real liberation. Because in that space, we know all the world is one, and we are connected to something inexhaustible. So how do we do that? How do we move from the false self into our true self? Well, the Course says we need to stop asking those around us to be symbols of our fear. And there is an exercise in the workbook that suggests that we look at someone who we consider our enemy and we ask them, those that we perceive to be enemies, we ask them to bless us. As you picture this person the lesson instructs, say to them, give me your blessing, holy child of God. I would behold you with the eyes of Christ and see my perfect sinlessness in you. Give me your blessing, holy child of God. It's an exercise I had to do with our previous president. And while I still believe his actions are a danger to our country, I can, in small doses, see the Christ within him. Underneath the ego, underneath all that bluster and bravado, it is a scared child who feels like he has never been seen. His patterns of deflection, all of his bravado, it covers up some deep wounds that probably will go unexamined for the rest of this lifetime that he's in. But you know what? It doesn't make him any less an innocent child of God. And that's the place I can feel some compassion for him, while at the same time advocating for ways to mitigate the real damage that he really can do in this world. Give me your blessing, holy child of God. Can you really say that to the people that you perceive being on the other side? Because you know what? Our choice has never been clearer in this country. Will we continue to stay on the same energetic level of the false self on both the micro and macro levels of our world and try desperately to hold them together, or will we raise our consciousness and allow those old identities and systems to fall apart so our true divine self as both individuals and a nation can emerge? This is what I think needs to happen. As long as we allow anyone to become a symbol of our fear or our hatred, and we see them as attacking us or arousing within us a desire to attack them, we will never escape the false self. And jubilants, we must let the things in our world that are no longer working for us, the things that are no longer serving us, whether they're on a personal or corporate level, we have to let them fall apart. What's on the other side will be amazing. I promise. When we insist, though, on continuing to live in the lower frequencies of fear, making enemies out of anyone around us who threatens the patterns of our false self, we're never going to experience true freedom. We're never going to have true liberation. So the question for you this morning is, what identities and old patterns are you holding on to that are holding you back, that are limiting your peace and your joy and your happiness in this moment? What is it in your life that's trying to fall apart? And you're keeping it together. I'm just barely holding it together. Well, stop. Let go. You're not anything that the false self says you are. Your true identity is that of a beloved, infinite child of God who is living in this world with one function: to step outside that false self and live daily as the light of the world. And sometimes we get confused and we think we're this separate being with all of our likes and our dislikes, and our follies and our foibles. But jubilance, that's just your launching pad. That's not your life. That's not who you truly are. So when you're feeling all caught up, that person is ruining the world, or that person is ruining my life, look deeply at them. Be willing. Be willing to ask those you see as doing wrong in this world to bless you, so you can see the same divinity dwells in them that dwells in you. And when you realize, you can see, even if just for half a second, you can see the divinity in that person, then you will truly be free, because you will understand that all the world is one.